Hello and welcome to JJ Meets World. I'm your host with the most, JJ Gordon. My intent is to meet every single person in the world, and today's episode, I get to meet Matt Kish. Matt is an illustrator. We get to talk about some amazing work that he's done, and you might be inspired to read Moby-Dick after this episode. That's right. We did what your high school English teacher couldn't do. All of this and so much more on today's episode of JJ Meets World. And by the way, if you'd like to help support our podcast, visit jjmeetsworld.com where you can donate to our Patreon, pick up some killer swag at our merch shop, or click the link to Apple Podcast and give us a 5-star review.
1, 2, 3, 4. JJ Gordon, sort of like that Indiana Jones, in that he's always sniffing out his next adventure. Yes, he is. He's always interviewing guests so he can have them on his show and they can talk about pop culture, arts, and leisure. JJ has his flag unfurled and he likes his french fries curled, and he's fun and then he twirled as he goes to meet the world. He will march into the rain even if his ankle sprained. Take a peek inside his brain. This podcast is called JJ Meets World.
Let's talk about one of the most tragic cases from Hollywood, and that is Don Bluth. Don Bluth worked for Disney for a while, went on his own, and created some of the most enduring animated films of all time outside of the Disney studios. In fact, sometimes people give credit to his work as being Disney movies, but they're not really. So, for example, let's talk about a couple of these things, okay?
Yeah.
So Don Bluth, in this episode of JJ Meets World, I talk about The Secret of Nim. So that is an amazing movie that Don Bluth had done back in the day. He did Anastasia, All Dogs Go to Heaven. An
American Tale.
An American Tale.
The Land Before Time.
This guy had such amazing... he's made amazing films, and like he still is making stuff. So Dragon's Lair, I think people out there who play video games will know the Dragon's Lair, and you can see Don Bluth, you can recognize his animation style, you can see that look, and unfortunately, every now and then he gets the credit he deserves, but in the wrong way, because they're like Titan AE, directed by this guy who directed all this other stuff, but it didn't do that well. And I always hope, because he's still, he's got a project that apparently might come out next year. We'll see what happens. He is a champion of hand-drawn animation. He loves it. And I think he wants to continue doing it in a world where we have only computer-generated animation. And no slight against CG animation, no slight against using new tools and technology. But I do love when someone, watching those videos, Tucker, I imagine this touches you somewhere too, seeing videos of like The Lion King being made, and you see an animator who has like 7 sheets of paper in their hand and they're flipping back and forth to watch Scar like raise an eyebrow slightly, and you see hours and hours of work that go into 2 moments on screen.
I always marveled at the consistency of those illustrators and how they could draw a number of, montage images, and that they all look like it's one physical object in space. I like to doodle. I like to illustrate from time to time, just as a hobby. But my consistency is all over the map. I can't do it. And I was always amazed at their ability to maintain proportion and smoothness. And when I think about Don Bluth characters, it's something in their face, in the human's face, in the nose and the mouth, that tells you, oh, that's a Don Bluth animation right there. And it's hard for me to even describe it beyond that, but I think that's where my eyes gravitate to. I'm just looking at even a couple of stills from absolute classics like An American Tale, which is the superior one, or The Land Before Time, and everything is in the expression in the face. Something about it is where the Don Bluth ness seems to come out of it. And these are films that I hold very, very near and dear to my heart, and they're not making them like they used to. And hopefully Don can bring back some of those glory days. I remember scenes like in did he do All Dogs? Yeah, All Dogs Go to Heaven, when the dog first dies, and just being absolutely terrified by everything I was seeing. Or in An American Tale, when the mice make the giant rat robot slash monster thing, just the absolute nightmare fuel that comes out of it. How afraid I was of Sharptooth in The Land Before Time, when Littlefoot's mother defends her baby. These are kind of like visceral scenes that you don't really see in animation anymore. And these were movies aimed at children, but they were so powerful that we carry them with us as adults.
And I think it was probably the first time that adults were thought of as part of the audience. Animation has all, like, when Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs came out, it was really thought of as like this marvel. And so everyone went to it. But at one point, animation became a children's realm. And it's really unfortunate. And Don Bluth tackles that. And think about, like, even this, An American Tale. If you're an immigrant, or you have parents who had immigrated to, like, the United States, they made a movie about your struggle. They made a movie about your journey to your new home. And if you are if you're watching Land Before Time and you're a parent, you are living the nightmare of not being, of protecting your child, but not being there for your child. And how does that work? And that aspect of being a child when you have to start finding your own way in the world. The amount of things that he tackles through this is just absolutely amazing. One of my favorites is the We're Back, a Dinosaur Story. And great, and I mean, like, great voice work in that thing. And I don't think he directed that, but I think he had a hand in getting that thing off the ground. But it's just so fun to watch. And it's so fun to just see it. And, Rockadoodle, aimed at, the people who loved the Elvis, right? So it's an Elvis storyline, but it's also framed by the world of being a rural farmer in a flood. I remember watching Rockadoodle. It came out in 91. And in 1997, when we're experiencing the flood in the upper Midwest, I thought, oh my God, they nailed it. This is exactly what farmers felt like. And now it's in my own town, and the rage of Mother Nature. I'm amazed at some of that stuff. But I also want to say this: choosing a project for Don Bluth must have been very difficult, because there's a lot of great stories to tell. And that leads into our guest today, Matt Kish. And Matt, who I had never met before. In fact, the only reason I knew Matt is because Tucker had said, hey, listen, Greg Carlson made a great documentary. You got to see it. And you sent me the information on that. And boy, I was blown away by how amazing this conversation is today. Weren't you?
I loved this conversation. I've been looking forward to listening to Matt for a while now. And, JJ, the mission of this show is for JJ to meet the world. And so as I've been looking at further guests, I'm going, God, who has JJ not met that I can reach out to right now? That would be a fantastic interview. And Matt was right at the top of that list. Greg, the way that I met Matt was through Greg Carlson, previous podcast guest. In fact, the person with the most appearances on this show, Greg Carlson. And in excuse me, in 2012, Greg produced a short documentary about Matt's artwork, illustrating Moby-Dick, which we talk about in this episode. Greg's documentary is called Inside the Whale. It's available on Vimeo, and I'm going to link to it here in the show notes if you want to check it out. It's 10 minutes long, and that was how I met Matt and fell in love with his art style. I follow him on Instagram. He does a lot of photography. He does a lot of illustration. He does a lot of mixed media art. So all of those links will be in the show notes. And after you've heard this conversation, I guarantee you're going to want to check out his artwork. And you may also want to pick up just a copy of Moby-Dick and read it.
Oh, I think that it inspired me to pick up a copy of Moby Dick. I would love to grab one right now. So, listen, sit back, relax, enjoy this episode of JJ Meets World. It's a great conversation. And if you're listening to this in multiple parts, maybe on your commute, you're definitely not, you're going to want to wait until a new question starts. So, get through a whole chunk of it and then press pause. Tucker, let's roll this episode, man.
JJ Meets World.
Welcome to the virtual studio of JJ Meets World, Matt Kish. Really a pleasure to have you, Matt.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here, and it's cool to hear Tucker's voice again. It's been quite a few years, I think, since our paths crossed.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to remember. Was it 2010 that Greg made the documentary about you and your Moby-Dick book?
Actually, it was the book came out in November of 2011, and I think I arrived in Fargo. I remember this because I remember talking about my family. My family knows that I really have an intense dislike for cold weather. So we all got a good laugh out of the fact that I had been invited to Fargo, North Dakota in early January of 2012. And I think I arrived January 3rd. I don't know why I remember this also specifically. And the temperature was 6 when I arrived, and that was the high of my entire trip.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
I feel like that year was unseasonably cold too. So you picked a really great window of time to come here.
Thank you so much. I was actually gifted a specific Arctic rated Columbia coat to go by my wife because she knew otherwise I would probably never survive the experience.
Well, I'm glad that you made it here. I find it funny. I think more people travel to Fargo during the winter months than they do during like our nice summer weather. But to be quite honest, we go from winter to like it snowed in May in
Jeez.
Fargo this year. And right now it looks beautiful out, but it is so humid and so muggy. You would think that you're in southern Florida right now.
I've heard
And
that the mosquitoes can get quite large too, can't they?
Oh yeah, they could carry away like a 10-pound baby easy. So yeah, we we're hardy people up here. We used to build houses out of dirt.
I remember when I went too, there was not a lot of snow on the ground, but it was brutally cold. And so that's really about all I saw because there was almost no greenery. It was January and there was just dirt and clay and potato fields. I mean, the people were wonderful. Everyone there was fantastic to me, which actually really made me oddly fond of a city I never even imagined that I would have the opportunity to visit. So overall, my impression of Fargo was really pretty fantastic, other than the absolutely lunar temperatures. I felt like I was walking on the moon.
Well, we pay pretty well to get people to endorse our town. So maybe you could be the next person like on the North Dakota tourism leaflet that we
It would be an honor. It would be an absolute honor.
Okay, so Matt, could you give the listeners an idea of who you are? Talk a little bit about how you grew up, how you got into the art that you're making and giving to the world.
Sure. I've taken sort of an unconventional path to having some success as an illustrator. It's not anything I ever would have really expected. I grew up. I'm old. I'm going to turn 51 in less than a week, which still seems kind of unfathomable to me. I don't feel 51 certainly, and I guess I'm told I don't look it, so I suppose that's a good thing.
I would not have guessed 51 at all.
Thank you. That is good. So, I grew up in this house where, my father was an avid reader of comic books and science fiction. And, they had all these amazing vintage children's picture books, from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And so, I grew up surrounded by imagery, surrounded by illustrations, surrounded by these visual depictions of written narratives. And that made a really enormous impression on me from even before I was able to read. I remember looking at a lot of these books of my parents and becoming cognizant of the fact that these pictures were telling a story, even without the words there, even without being able to read the words. I knew that there was some sort of story there. And so that made a big impression on me because ever since then, I think I've been an extraordinarily visual person. I tend to think in images. I tend to remember images better than words and names. And ever since I have been a reader, I have always seen whatever it is that I'm reading in my mind. And what I mean by that is not, the words. We all see the words and the letters on the page. That's how we read. But I create a visual narrative to go along with everything I'm reading. That being said, I drew a lot as a kid. I mean, many of us did, but I never pursued art, not as a degree, not in terms of an education. I'm largely self-taught. So I had been drawing and making comics and making zines, ever since I was in my late 20s. But I think perhaps due to a lack of a degree and maybe really I'm not terribly good at promoting myself. It's hard to sort of shove your work into somebody's hands and say, hey, take a look at this. Give me some money for this. So, I was 40 years old before I had any kind of what would be called measurable success as an artist or an illustrator. So, I had several careers prior to that. I was an English teacher. I'd worked in a bookstore, and I'm currently working in a public library, which is a career I love because it keeps me connected with books, and I really believe in what public libraries do. But anyway, so here's what I meant about rambling. So I got to get to the point. 40 years old, right? I finally have a career I really love as a public librarian. I've earned a master's degree. I'm thinking it's time for me to just kind of give up art, right? It's taking up a lot of my time. I could be spending this time with my wife. I could be doing other things. It's not really earning me any money. Nobody really knows what I'm doing. Nobody really sees it. There was not much in terms of the art that I was making that was really very fulfilling. So this was 2009. Yeah, late summer 2009. I had just turned 40 years old in June. And I thought, I can't just stop cold turkey. I have to give myself one last sort of idiotically ambitious project to go out on, and then I'm going to be done. Mic drop, walk off the stage, it's over. I disappear. So, the novel Moby-Dick is one of a small handful of works of literature that have had an enormous impact on me as a person and as a reader and as a thinker. And I thought, I've seen a lot of illustrated versions, but none of them really quite match what I've always imagined in my head. And I want to create what, for me, Matt Kish, would be the personal, definitive, idiosyncratic illustrated version of Moby-Dick that I've always seen as a reader. And then that'll be it. That'll be the last thing I do. And weirdly enough, of course, as so often happens in life, it attracted an enormous amount of attention and led to me having an agent and a publisher and became a real rather huge book, an illustrated book. So what was intended to be my final act as an artist and as a creator of visual works really sort of ignited a renaissance, I guess, a rebirth, a second career. And since then, stuff has happened in the last 10 years that I would have never imagined. I mean, I've had a museum show, gallery shows, people buy my art. I've illustrated quite a few books. It's really just been crazy. So I really feel tremendously fortunate to have had this all happen to me. It's literally unimaginable, and I've loved every minute of it. And even if it ends tomorrow, I will not regret any of it. It's just been an absolute blast, and I'm one of the luckiest people in the world.
One of the things that I really take away from this is that, the thing you want happens when you stop looking for it. I mean, it's
Yes.
the basis of all romantic comedies, right?
Mhm.
So you're living a real life romantic comedy, Matt.
Yeah, it is. And that's a really good way to put it, because in a lot of ways you feel like art is this thing you're pursuing and you're in love with, and there's unrequited love and there's rejections and there's this courtship, and sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't. That's a perfect analogy.
So let's talk about your Moby-Dick project right now. And so the book itself is called Moby-Dick in Pictures, one
Right.
drawing for every page, correct?
Yep, that's the title.
And people can still buy it. It's still available if you want to get a hold of this book. And I mean, it makes one heck of a conversation starter, that's for sure.
Yeah, it is huge. I think it weighs in at 3 or 4 pounds. It's close to 600 pages, about 8 by 10. It's a doorstop.
You know what it amazes me about this the most is that picking Moby-Dick is perfect. Not only does it mean something to you as a lover of literature, but there is a universal quality to Moby-Dick.
Yes.
So many people even if they haven't read it, they know about Moby-Dick.
Oh yeah, it looms so large, and not just the American consciousness, but the global consciousness. And it's funny. It's a deeply polarizing book. A lot of people that you talk to, as you said, nearly everyone is familiar with it, but they either there are those that love it passionately and obsessively, and those that absolutely despise it and either say they will never read it again. They're often forced to in school, or they will never ever read it because they just can't even imagine reading 600 pages about a guy chasing after a whale. So it's pretty fascinating the way it sort of ignites this passionate polarization. These people that love it and just despise it.
So when you embark on something like this project, uh, is it hard? Do you constantly get the question of like, oh, so do you have a favorite from the collection?
Yeah, I get it's amazing. I get a lot of really strange questions like that. What is your favorite? What was your least favorite? Could you do it again? Do you regret it? Some people will, and I actually kind of relish this. Some people will sort of challenge me. Why did you depict this character, this moment in the way that you chose to? And I really kind of like those questions because it shows that people are really engaged with it, and it shows that people are passionate about it. And the other thing that I like perhaps the most about it is that I'm really just a normal person. I mean, I may have done some strange things, but I'm just a person, and I don't like how we at times tend to have this deferential attitude towards creators. Everyone, every musician, every poet, every writer, every director, every movie star. We're all just human beings, and we should all respect one another certainly, but we don't need to be putting anyone on a pedestal. And I like it when people sort of, I don't want to say come at me because it's not a confrontation, but when they feel that they can come to me and disagree with me, or when they can feel that they can come to me and they can question me about something, I love that because I feel like, art matters the most when people can really engage with it. And you can't engage with something if you're putting it on a pedestal and you're treating it as above critique and above questioning. I mean, I want my work to be questioned, torn apart, put back together. A lot of the illustrations that I did for Moby Dick were on paper that I found, that I ripped out of old books, old television plans, things like that, old photographs, old maps, and I would paint over those. And on more than one occasion, people have come up to me thinking that they got me. They're like, "Oh, I'm going to get him with this," and they'd say, "What would you do if someone took your book, and tore the pages out and painted over it, or cut it up, or collaged it?" But I always say I would love that. That's what we have to do. We take what has come before us and we recontextualize it through the lens of our own experiences, and we make something new out of it. And that is a huge, huge compliment.
Even if it's criticism, the mere fact that they're coming up to you with something must also communicate that they care about it, that they took the time to look at your art, to digest your art, to come up with an opinion on your art. And even if their question is in the form of criticism, that's got to feel good. Like from time to time, we'll get comments from people who listen to this podcast, and from time to time, those comments are critical.
Mhm.
But even when they're critical, I'm like, God, I'm really happy that they took the time to listen to our show and form an opinion on something. It meant that we put something out into the world that they allowed to become a part of their life for a little bit, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you really want that kind of contact. I mean, I think, there's a lot of talk about, a lot of people will talk about how to be an artist. This is what you got to do. This is how to be an artist. This is the only way to be a valid artist. And they'll say, just the real artists, they do it for themselves. They don't care what other people think. Honestly, I think that's bullshit. I think everyone who creates something, whether it's a podcast or an album or music or a poem, you want that kind of connection. And even like you said, even if that connection is one of questioning, one of critique, you have formed a connection, you have impacted someone, and you have sort of pushed the human experience forward. And that's, I think, the best that any of us can hope for with what we create. We have a limited amount of time and energy, and we want that to mean something. We don't want it to just pass.
I want to take just a step back too to talk about how you used these, the found pages, so to
Right.
speak, as a canvas for a lot of these. I love that because to me, I'm looking at not just the art you created on top of whatever was on that page, but it also gives me appreciation for what is on it. How would you feel if someone pulled a page out of your book and drew on it? Well, how about this? I never would have seen this image before, especially the ones where you have like schematics, where you
Right,
drew the
right.
schematics. There is something beyond, there's something deeper in this as well, and it gives it a second life that I just dig like there's no tomorrow. In fact, I think I there's a particular one where it's a drawing and it looks almost otherworldly, and it looks like there's 4 red eyes
Okay,
on
yeah,
this
yeah.
humanoid figure, and it's on top of schematics for what looks like a microchip or something. And I love that, and it speaks to me. Do you ever have people tell you what their favorite is?
Yeah, yeah, a lot of people do. And it's funny. So Moby Dick is sort of structured in a really fascinating way. Depending on the edition you buy, where the font size will be slightly different. The book runs anywhere from maybe 400 to 600 pages, right? But we are so conditioned as modern readers to expect a certain kind of structure from our literature, where there's this sort of introduction of characters and setting, this rising action. I mean, we all know the graph, But Moby Dick was written in the middle of the 19th century. It was published initially in 1851. I actually, and it's funny, I don't know a whole lot about Melville himself or his life, which puzzles a lot of people. But I don't know if he had an editor. I don't know if editors existed back then. I don't know how the book was published. But the structure of it is very strange in that it's sort of this Frankenstein construction of what seems like nonfiction, what seems like high adventure, what seems like spiritual and philosophical rumination. What there are chapters that resemble poetry, chapters that resemble theater, but what we tend to think of as like the climax of the novel, the 3 days chasing the white whale, and the Titanic clash of Ahab and Moby Dick. That all happens in the final 3 chapters of the novel, which cover maybe 15 pages out of for the edition I used, 15 pages out of 552. So much of the rest of the book is this sort of mosaic of strange scenes. And when people, I notice, it's funny, when a lot of people talk to me about what their favorite illustration was, they are almost always illustrations of those final 3 chapters, because most people who have a passing familiarity with the story, we remember that. We remember the struggle and the battle against the white whale, and we tend to sort of gloss over the long conversations in the crow's nest or below decks, or some conversation between Ahab and Starbuck about children and wives. And, that's every bit as rich, but I think in some ways, due to the way we're conditioned as readers and viewers today, it doesn't always stick as much. So it's been sort of fascinating to view Moby Dick through this contemporary lens of what people tell me they remember and they like the most.
Have you had a lot of people who have been like, read or looked at what you've done, and it's inspired them to actually go back and read Moby Dick?
Yes, yes. I just got, during quarantine, as we're all sort of hunkered down, I just got this really long email from someone who I've never met. And it was wonderful because, so rarely do we receive an email that's more than a sentence or two. It's really nice to actually be able to sit down and read what's basically an electronic letter. And this woman talked at length about how what I had done had inspired her to finally go back and read this book that she had been intending to read for most of her life. I gather she's probably a middle-aged woman, and she's had a long career, and she's a parent and a wife. And it's an incredible honor to know that something that I created could galvanize someone into taking on such an enormous and daunting and challenging book. I mean, again, it's just really humbling. It doesn't make me think like, oh, I'm really awesome. I have this power. It makes me just, again, very grateful that I can be like a tiny little barnacle attached to this enormous cultural body of Moby Dick, and know that I've made this small contribution to something that is such an essential part of our artistic character.
Oh, I mean, that's an amazing way to think about it. And I imagine that there's a good number of people out there too who have never read Moby-Dick. They understand the gist, right?
Right.
So the gist of something that's almost 600 pages. Um, and they can see this and it inspires them to take it on because it is daunting, right? Moby-Dick it's like trying to read the Iliad, and
Right.
it's a daunting task to a lot of people because we've built it up. We
Yeah.
built it up for so long, and getting these visual representations is so neat. If you'll allow me, I'd love to tell you about what my favorite image is.
Oh, yes, I would love to hear this.
Um, it's all in blue and it's in tiny squares, and
Oh,
it's
I know exactly the one you're talking about.
yeah,
It's the whale breaching and going below the water and breaching again, and right? Is that the one? It's like a
that's
series of
that's
panels.
the one.
Yes.
And one of the things I love the most about this is I mean, there's got to be what, maybe 60, 70 panels that comprise the single image.
Yeah, I
And
used to know the exact number, and I can't remember because I counted it out very carefully.
you have a lot of panels in this
Hmm.
that represent what I think the ocean is, which is nothing.
Right.
I love it. So the ones where the whale is breaching are great,
Right. Right.
and it gives you an idea of really what the viewpoint is like from the ship. But
Hmm.
you also have the viewpoint of here is just the water and the waves. And I think one of the real testaments to watching someone's art is having to replicate the same idea and feeling over and over and over again.
Right.
And
Right.
so in the panels that you have where it's just the horizon and the water, each one is different. Now, you could have easily taken that and just said, like, nope, I'm going to use just whether you want to create your own stencil or whether you just want to say, nope, it's going to be represented by 3 lines that look like this. But each one is different. And there's so much going on here that I love it. And it also reminds me of, have you ever seen I believe they're Dutch. They're tiles that are all done in blue and white, and it's a very popular uh, piece of Dutch culture to have these tiles that represent. There'll be a depiction of wheat, and there'll be a depiction of
Oh,
somebody,
yeah.
along the water. It To me, it evokes that feeling, and we had some of those that my grandfather brought back from a trip to Europe, and they hung in our kitchen for years. And when I saw this image, I immediately was like, I'm in the kitchen, in my old kitchen right now, and I'm looking
Hmm.
at something brand new that reminds me of something from yesterday. And I love that. I love how when a single piece of art means that to me, but it'll probably not mean that to anybody else on the planet.
Right. Right. You have come to it with this history of your own life, your own experiences. You are viewing and engaging with this art based on the lens of your own perceptions and your own experiences. And that's a really what you've hit on something really fascinating about art, which is that I think all artists, whatever they're creating, we have this intent. We intend for something to be a certain thing, right? But once you release it, once you let it go, once you make it available to others, you have to relinquish control, because in the end, people are going to come to your work and they're going to engage with it based on their own experiences and their own history and their own perspective. And it's folly to fight against that. You have to relish that and welcome that. And I have always been like, I had never thought of that Dutch. I know the ones you're talking about, but the Dutch tile example, I had never thought of that. That certainly was not part of my intent or my inspiration. But hearing this is such a valuable and beautiful thing to me, because again, it shows how multifaceted these things can be when you're able to share them with people. It's really beautiful. It's really moving.
So let's flip the coin over a little bit. And I'm going to ask you the questions that I would ask if I were your agent right now, right?
Right.
What's the next novel you're going to tackle, Matt? What let's start getting all the classics out there. I mean, you found success, and let's keep the train rolling.
It's funny when I was doing. I never expected to have a book in the first place. So I remember when I was doing some book appearances for the Moby-Dick book, which was my first. I went to Portland, Oregon, which is where my publisher is. I did quite a few in New York and Brooklyn. I came to North Dakota, Minnesota. I did a few here in Ohio. And everybody has a suggestion, right? Oh, and some of them you can tell people are just trying to challenge you. Some people are saying, "Oh, illustrate every page of the Bible," and what is the Bible? Like 1,000 pages? That would take years and years and years. So people are throwing all these ideas at me and again, that's exciting because it shows they like what I've done and they want to see me do something that has personal meaning to them. Moby Dick may not, they like Moby Dick, but they might be bigger fans of the Brothers Karamazov or Don Quixote or something like that. So, they're like, do this because, it's my favorite book. And again, that's a huge compliment that someone, in a sense, they're entrusting you with their vision. So I have continued to illustrate since then. I did Heart of Darkness a few years after that. And I had actually worked with this writer. It was interesting working with a living writer, Robert Kloss. He and I had a pretty good partnership. I illustrated several of his books, not every page, but several of his books. And that was weird because when somebody's dead, Herman Melville is dead, Joseph Conrad is dead. You don't really worry about what they'll think because they're gone. You can't disappoint Herman Melville. I mean, you can create that in your head, but you can't disappoint him. But Robert Kloss was sitting right there in Massachusetts, and if I did something that he thought sucked, he's going to be thinking, why did we get this asshole to illustrate my book? But, that was a pretty good creative partnership. But then, it's funny, around 4 years ago, I started having a bit more success on both maybe a personal and an aesthetic level, moving away from illustration and into, I guess, what would be called art. And, a lot of people are like, well, what's the difference between illustration and art? I mean, one could say they're both art, certainly, but, illustration is intended to be published, intended to depict something. And illustration, I think, even more so than art, is intended to be a product. It sounds kind of weird to say that, but it's meant to be consumed. It's meant to be marketable. Whereas with art, I think you have a little more latitude to experiment and to create bodies, create works that can stand alone, a single drawing, a single painting. I even had a museum show, which again kind of blew me away. But I've anyway, to make a long story short, I'm drifting back to this. I've started to get back into illustration. I am currently working on the Divine Comedy, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. I'm just about 20% of the way through the Inferno, and it's similar in scope and in style and in approach to what I did for Moby Dick. I'm using a lot of found paper. I'm using, actually, I've introduced a lot of collaged elements. I'm obsessed with comic books. I have been ever since I was a child. They're a huge part of me. And so I'm finding all of these bits of text and ephemera from comics. And there's a whole reason for this, which I can go into in a minute, but I don't want to talk your ear off.
Well, I'm giving you a high five across the internet about the comic books
awesome,
right now, man.
Awesome. Yeah, it's such a huge part of our, and that, that piece that you mentioned, JJ, that one that was your favorite, that series of, that was directly inspired by this sequential aspect of comic books. So, you have panel after panel after panel, you're distilling all of these moments in time into a specific visual sequence. That at that point in the Moby Dick project, I just wanted to do something that was really I thought, fuck it, I want to do a Moby Dick comic. So that was where that particular page came from. And it really sort of scratched an itch. Anyway, I'm getting off topic again. I'm so good at not being on topic.
Don't worry.
That is what this show is. That's totally cool.
Right. So I'm working on Dante's Inferno right now, and I do plan on doing all three parts of the Divine Comedy, the Purgatorio and the Paradiso, which are much less well-known works, and I've actually only read each of the Purgatorio and the Paradiso once. So it'll be kind of interesting to, they're not nearly as exciting as Hell. Hell is full of demons and devils and torment and puking and farting and shitting and nudity and violence, and it's, there's a lot visually to stimulate you as an illustrator in terms of Hell, but there's not that much in Purgatory or Paradise. A lot of angels.
So, what was the defining choice in going with Dante? I mean, was it something that you've loved for a long time? Was it something that you thought, gosh, just the visuals here are so amazing. I can go with this. Like, could you talk about your process of just deciding on
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
okay, is this rich enough for me to make something out of it?
Right. So this may, I don't know, it may offend some people a little bit. And this gets back to when I was talking before about how lucky I feel. And I do. I mean, every single day I feel fortunate because I have a really enjoyable and sustaining career as a public librarian. I mean, I not only do I enjoy that career a great deal, and it's deeply personally rewarding. It gives me, a decent standard of living, and it gives me the freedom to be able to pursue creatively whatever I want to pursue. And I don't mean this part in an arrogant way at all. It's just an actual statement of the truth. I don't really have to care whether my work is popular or published or marketable because I don't need to depend on it for an income. I do genuinely hope that it connects with people. That means, being able to go to a classroom or a college or a bookstore or even to do something like this and just talk to people and connect with people about my art means far, far more to me than any royalty check or publishing advance. I mean, those are wonderful. I don't take them for granted, but sales and money are not in any way, my prime motivator for making art. So when it comes to deciding on a project, the question that I ask myself is literally as simple as, what do I want to do next? And that's really what it is. And I, as someone who does tend to see things in my mind very, very clearly as I read them, I am drawn to works that are very visual, and there's a great deal of visual inspiration in the Inferno in particular. I mean, there's the descriptions are rich and vivid and wild and surreal. So I think it has inspired dozens of artists over the years. But they're also just books that mean a lot to me, things that I've enjoyed reading, things that I just simply want to illustrate in the manner in which I see them in my mind as I read them. So it's really just it's would this be fun? Shit, yeah, it'll be fun. So let's do it. I have to be excited about what I'm doing, or it becomes a chore. And I don't know that I am good enough to create art when it becomes a labor.
That is powerful, dude.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's keep going with this. How so you've got a full-time job. You're a
Yeah.
librarian.
Yeah. 40 hours a week.
How do you decide when it's time to be illustrating? I mean, do you say every night I'm going to devote some time to this? Is it in the middle of your penne? Can you go like, I gotta go to the room? Because I'm always curious. There are so many people out there who lead these dual lives as
Right.
an artist as well as somebody who knows I gotta pay the bills. I gotta have this structure, and I'm curious about how you chop up your day.
Right. Every now and then people will come up to me and they'll ask me, how did you get published? And, what advice do you have for an illustrator or an artist? And, I don't have a lot because so much of what happened for me was a weird confluence of definitely hard work and good work, but also just luck, being in the right place at the right time, things like that. But the only thing that I really will tell people in terms of how to be successful, how to make it as a creator or an artist, or really probably anything, this probably goes for anything in life, is really show up. Show up and know how to make a deadline. Those two things have helped me immensely, both as a librarian, really, but especially as an artist. We're coming up on 11 years now since I started this Moby-Dick project. And in 11 years, I've never missed a creative deadline. Everything I have promised that I would have done and turned in on time, I have. And this is going to sound like, old man yelling at cloud. And I don't really know a lot of young artists in their teens and 20s, but I know some, and some of them really seem to have a real problem, meeting a deadline. There's sort of this idea that you have to wait until everything is perfect, until you're totally inspired and the muse is speaking to you, and you're not busy or hungover or playing a video game or going out with your friends. And I don't think that that's a good way to approach it. I said earlier, I don't think that I can create art when it becomes a chore, but I do see it as a calling. And there are times when, even if you have a cold or a sore throat, you have to drag yourself to the drawing table and work against those things. And I've always been able to find the discipline to do that. So, for the Moby Dick project, I worked every single day, hours and hours a day, because I was creating an illustration per page per day. So over the span of 543 days consecutively, I created 552 illustrations for Moby Dick. I actually beat that pace of one a day. But I will say I paid a heavy, heavy cost. I had zero life for that year and a half. I mean, I was barely able to maintain my job and a relationship with my amazing wife, who was very patient through the entire thing. One of the things I learned from that is it's good to be disciplined, but think about the price you're paying. So what I do now is, just as you said, I am disciplined about making sure that I carve out at least an hour a day, every day, to work on something. If I don't finish a piece in a single day, that's fine. But I've worked on it. I've pushed the project forward. Momentum is a huge thing in creativity. It really is for me. I don't know if it is for everybody, but it really is for me. It's like, I use this example a lot, right? We've all done this. You buy that weight bench at the sporting goods store, and you're like, I'm going to fucking get ripped, right? I'm going to exercise at home. Like, this is it. This is my path towards Mr. Olympus. So you bring it home, you put it in your basement. That first week or two, you're lifting weights every day. Then that second or third week, you're like, I'll get to it tomorrow. And you do it maybe half the time. Then about a month later, you're starting to hang your hoodie on it. And about 2 months after that, you're just putting boxes on the weight bench. You're just not using it anymore. That momentum, you lose that inertia, and it becomes harder and harder to pick it up. So for me, I find if I keep myself working, even if I can only squeeze in 15 minutes a day, that keeps things moving forward, and it's that much easier to come back to the piece on the following day because I know I've already worked on it a little bit. If I put something down for a few days or a week, it just gets so hard to come back. So it's discipline. It's just you take to it the same discipline you do towards anything, and it pays. Man, it really pays off. Like I sometimes feel like an artistic bodybuilder.
When you were talking about your deadline, and you tell me if I'm full of shit on this, but I used to work at a video store.
Okay.
And so I know the meaning of a deadline. It's called the return date. And if you don't get it there in time, you pay a late fee. You work in a library where there is a clear stamped return date of when a book
Right.
is due. Do you think that somewhere in your DNA, you have now been programmed to know this date is the date that my book, more or less, is due?
Yeah. I think you're right. I think whether it's stamped in the DNA or it's simply a habit that has been ingrained in me, like it's this sort of mental pathway. Like I have this friend. He talks a lot about these mental channels that we carve for ourselves. They're like rivers in our head. The more the river runs in one direction, the deeper that channel gets, which is both good and bad. Because if you want to change it, it becomes harder to change those deeply carved channels. Yeah, but for me, that idea of, again, meeting a deadline, following that clock, that calendar, paying attention, thinking about more than just being in the moment, looking ahead to the future, planning your time. It's just so thoroughly inground in me that it's a habit now. It's actually difficult. It's funny. This is sort of an example. So when I did Moby Dick, I'll make this really quick. When I was working on Moby Dick, my wife and I were living about an hour and a half from where we worked. So we had a 3-hour commute daily. We would be up at dawn. We would be out the door by 7. I wouldn't get to these Moby Dick illustrations till like 6:30, 7 at night sometimes. It was a grind. I mean, like I said, it was a heavy price. So then we finally moved, and now we live maybe 20 minutes from where we work, and I suddenly had all this time, right? I had all of this free time, and at first I thought, oh, I'm going to get twice as much done. But for a while, I found that luxury of time to be sort of off-putting. Like, I have too much time now. I don't have those restrictions of deadlines looming over me, and you've got to get this done by this time. And I found it took me a real long time to adjust to that. and to be able to manage the time I had better. More of it was a bad thing because it was too freeing. So, now I feel like I've reached a good equilibrium, but that was a weird adjustment.
I can really imagine that. And um, do you ever find yourself uh, going over hurdles that you create for yourself in your own mind? For example, um, gosh, I really feel like this would be best done in charcoal. Well, I don't have really the exact tool I need to create this, so I'll just put this off for a little bit. No. I want to get this done, and even if I have to
Right.
suffer from not being able to use the exact tool I need, I still want to make sure that I get this on paper. I get this on the canvas now.
Right. There are, but they're actually the hurdle that I'm going to talk to you about is more insidious and more embarrassing and more troubling than even that. So there's this song by Genesis called Duchess. I'm really revealing my age because I think it's from an album that came out in 1980. It's from the album Duke, and it's about this singer who becomes and I knew about this song long before I had any success, and I thought, that's not me. That'll never happen to me. She becomes extremely popular, and then her career falls apart because she worries too much about remaining popular. And I never, ever thought I would fall into that trap, especially because I came to illustration so late in life and through such an unconventional path that I never felt like I would fall prey to worrying about the expectations of others. And again, I'm not talking about hoping that my work connects with people. I'm talking about that idea of hoping you remain popular, hoping you remain marketable, hoping that you stick with an editor and a publisher. But it's been a little while now, 5 or 6 years ago, about halfway through this all, I found, that hurdle really did become this creeping and insidious worry. I started second guessing myself. I guess that's a better way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
I would be illustrating a project, and I would come to the next piece, the next illustration, the next page, and rather than just have the courage to go with what was immediately intuitive in my mind, there started to be the second guessing. Is this good enough? Is this what people will expect? Will this be popular? And it didn't last long, but it lasted long enough to really be an incredibly sobering and mildly terrifying reality check, because it's a real fine balance. You want to stick to what your intuition tells you is the creative path forward, but you don't want to do that to the extent where you seem to have total disregard for the people that you hope your art connects with. So finding that sweet spot between being true to yourself, but also understanding that we are creating all of this as a sense of community of human beings, it can be hard to find. But I think I've gotten back on track in the last few years. But that was the biggest obstacle for me, and I was ashamed. I was ashamed of it because I felt like, wow, have I become some sort of like establishment sellout? Now that I've been successful and I'm getting royalty checks, have I lost all credibility and validity as an artist? It was a really kind of horrible few months while I kind of struggled through that. And it really got in the way of my productivity too, because in the absence of being able to see my way through that, I kind of found myself delaying a lot of things, saying, well, I'm not going to work on this until I can get this sorted out in my head. But then eventually the deadline approaches and you have to. So it was a really rough time. That was the biggest obstacle I've ever faced as an illustrator, was, finding my way back to doing it out of love and passion and a desire to connect with people, but without worrying too much about what people want and expect. It's not an easy place to be in.
Wow. I think that is uh, that's a struggle and a kind of a just like a mind fuck that it would be incredibly difficult to get past. And like, my God, thank goodness you've got a song that has already laid out the groundwork for you as a map.
Yeah.
Um, can I quickly ask you? We just did an episode of JJ Meets World where we launched our first ever JJ Meets World book club.
Okay.
And Tucker and I had the ability to talk about books that have that we think is worthwhile for people to check out. We chose a lot of books from our childhood.
Right.
what are you reading right now? Just out of curiosity.
I read a lot of books from my childhood. It's funny. I go back and I do find myself, and there's a reason for this. And again, this explanation is probably longer than you had anticipated. Every answer is like 15 fucking minutes when it could be 5.
Go for it.
Right.
Go for it.
So there's a reason for this. When again, I don't know much about Herman Melville, but I know a little bit. So Herman Melville had a tremendous amount of success early in his career writing what would be considered more or less just adventure novels. They are delightful and wonderful, but they don't have the intellectual depth or weight that his later work, including Moby-Dick, does. Moby-Dick at the time was something that he was extraordinarily proud of, and he felt he had written this incredibly powerful, deep, and challenging novel, but it was a commercial failure and more or less ruined his career as an author. He never really recovered from that. So that's sort of puzzling. Melville becomes this tragic character. So Melville had a small portable writing desk, almost like a little box with an angled top that he could carry around with him and put anywhere that he wanted to sit down and begin writing. And I read the book Why Read Moby-Dick by Nathaniel Philbrick a while ago. It's actually really good. It's very slim, but it's a great volume, and it's a great introduction to Moby-Dick. And near the end of that, Philbrick talks about how when Melville passed away and his family was going through his belongings, they found that they were going through the writing desk, and it was hollow. So if you could turn it over, you could see inside the bottom because it was like a box. And pasted inside the writing desk was a small handwritten piece of paper that said, "Hold true to the dreams of thy youth." And it's a quote from someone, Schopenhauer, I think is the philosopher's name. "Hold true to the dreams of thy youth." And Philbrick sort of sees that as the key to Melville as a writer and as an artist. That everything that Melville was doing, even after the tremendous commercial failure of Moby Dick, was him holding true to those youthful dreams of his. The things that he thought about, the things that provoked in him a sense of wonder as a young person, were what continued to drive him as a writer in the face of uh, reader apathy and commercial failure and financial obscurity. And that made an enormous impression on me because, again, it brought me back to what I talked about at the beginning here. Those books, those illustrated picture books and those comics and those science fiction book covers that I looked at so often as a kid, those when I was a young person, those really provoked in me a sense of wonder. And it wasn't until I read Philbrick's book and thought about the way that intersected with Melville and my interest in Melville and the reasons that I make art. And I realized that, that's why I'm doing it. When I read anything and I see it in my mind, I want to see something wonderful. I want to see something that provokes in me a sense of awe, a sense of excitement, this idea that, wow, I've never seen or experienced this before. That sense of wonder is so crucial to me. So I find myself as an adult, approaching the age of 51 now, reading less and less what would be considered complicated adult literature. I don't read a lot of contemporary fiction. And when I do read a novel, it tends to be one of the classics. Not that I think that makes me any better or smarter than anyone else. Not at all. It just tends to be what I'm drawn to. But more than anything else, I tend to go back and read these I guess they would be called like beginning readers, stuff you read when you're 9, 10, 11, and 12. Those stories, because again, they reawaken in me that sense of wonder that is so essential to me being able to feel healthy and happy and ready to keep pushing forward in a world that is so often difficult and challenging and even hostile. So right now, gosh, I go through them so quickly. A couple of things that I've read recently are, the Moomin books by Tove Jansson?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've recently reread those. I'm currently reading, there are 5 of them, but I've only ever been able to get a hold of 2 because the rest are out of print. They're these books about an elephant that wears a purple robe named Uncle. And he lives in this enormous home called Homeward, which resembles like a skyscraper fort. And these are probably, again, written for 12, 13-year-old kids. And Uncle is very rich, and he has all these sort of strange adventures in his skyscraper fort. I'm reading those. Those are coming out from New York Review Children's Books. And I recently reread this pretty obscure book that not a lot of people seem to remember called The Borables by Paul Larrabee, I think is his name, and it's about these strange sort of goblin-like creatures. What they actually are is they're children who have lost their parents. So then they get taken in by the Borbles and they live in the London sewers. And it's a pretty violent book actually. There's a lot of stabbings and a lot of mischief. But I tend to go back to this kind of stuff over and over and over again. And then I intersperse that with the classics like Dante's Inferno and the Iliad and the Odyssey and things like that. But yeah, it really is the stuff that I read when I was probably 12. And I guess that sort of connects to the comics too. Why even now I'm reading comic books that came out in 1982.
I think of other great artists who have been inspired by something and needed to take words on a page and adapt them into something because they loved it so much. And I think of um uh growing up, one of my favorite movies was um oh man, why can't I think of the title of the movie now?
Captain Ron.
Yeah, Captain Ron. No. Well, what? Anyway, well, it's adapted from Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. What's
Right,
the
it's called The
movie
Secret of Nim.
Secret of Nim. There we go.
Yeah.
Why couldn't I come up with that? Nim is right there in front of me. But Don Bluth loved those novels so much that he goes, this has to be adapted. And he could see every page in what I kind of imagine is a similar way that you see every page.
Right.
And, goes from that. Also, side note, probably the most terrifying movie aimed at children that I saw as a kid. That thing scared the bejesus out of me on a regular
When did
basis.
that come out? Because I remember we had a very small movie theater, and I grew up in a town near Cleveland, Ohio, but the town itself was about half an hour outside of Cleveland, so it was a relatively small town, and we had a small local theater, and I remember walking to the theater to see that. Was that like 82, 83?
82, 1982.
So I'd have been 13 years old, and yeah, I remember even at the age of 13, that owl scared the shit out of me.
Right?
That, and it's sort of like he looms up and he says, "Why have you come?" in this booming voice with those glowing eyes. And man, I was cringing in my seats as a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic cast too. I mean, Derek Jacobi, Dom DeLuise, Elizabeth Hartman.
And what was the other? I think there was another. Was his name Brutus? The one with he had a spear. He was the sort of the martial crow.
Yep.
Yeah, and there were some really intense scenes with him during the storm, moving the storm. Man, what a great film! I got to go watch it. I haven't seen that in decades. I need to rewatch that now. That is a beautiful piece of film.
It is well, and it is. The storyline to it is also just light years ahead of what people were thinking about at that time. Everything from genetic testing all the way up to like being displaced and like having your home destroyed, like.
And broken families. And
I mean, if you watch that with a 2020 style eye, you're like, oh my God, they had no idea how much this was going to reflect the future. And I think that that movie is just so good, but the books, I mean, this is a situation where I hold the books and the movie in the same esteem,
right?
Because The Secret of Nim takes the story from Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim and adapts it in a way that makes it an almost perfect cinematic adventure. Sometimes I get so frustrated because people say, oh, well, I like the book better because the book did this. Well, yeah, the book had the ability to keep your attention for 45 straight hours of reading.
Right.
This has got to get it done in 90 minutes. So, that's the other thing I wanted to ask you was, so when you're going through, like, for example, like with your Dante project you're working on, do you read and then do you highlight a word, a phrase? Do you read the whole page and then let it sink in for a little bit? How does the process of page to illustration work for you?
Right. And Moby-Dick was different than everything that I have done since. With Moby-Dick, the novel itself is such a strangely structured thing, as I talked about before, that with Moby-Dick, I would read a few chapters ahead each, week or two. But what I would do, how I approach each illustration for Moby-Dick was I would really isolate the page that I was illustrating that day. And I would simply read that page over and over and over and over again until something on that page provoked in my mind, a visual response. Often the challenge with that was that there were too many. I would have to narrow it down to sort of what I wanted to do. But I was cognizant that approach would create, and I use this word a lot, but it's very fitting. My illustrations for Moby-Dick are more like a mosaic. They are not nearly, there's a wide variety of media and styles of representation, and I'm selecting these different isolated moments from the book to show simply because that's what was on that page that I wanted to show. So while they do work well sequentially, the illustrations in Moby Dick, I think, really also work well as individual pieces, as individual moments in time. They don't necessarily have to be seen. It's not a graphic novel. It's not a storyboard. It is a mosaic of images and impressions from this enormous, sprawling novel. Everything that I've illustrated since then, I've taken a somewhat different approach. Heart of Darkness, to some degree, the Robert Kloss books. I guess Calvino was different. Calvino's a very different thing. But the approach I'm taking now with Dante's Inferno is very much like what I took with Heart of Darkness, which is this idea that while each individual piece is something that I hope is going to be visually interesting and exciting, they do work best when viewed and engaged with as a group. So, you look at the first one, then the second one, then the third one. And over time, you begin to see consistencies in a visual narrative emerge much more strongly. So with Dante's Inferno, I read the entire thing before beginning, and it's broken up into 33 cantos. The cantos are basically like chapters of verse. So I'll read the entire canto, and then I'll start breaking that down. I'm doing 4 illustrations per canto, which comes out to roughly 1 per page. The cantos are anywhere from 4 to 6 pages long. But what I'm doing is I'm really trying to break down each chapter into the 4 key visual moments that would work best when seen one after the other. So almost like a quad of illustrations, because I really do want this to be the kind of thing that even if you are not familiar with the poem itself, even if you're not reading along with it as you're looking at my work, you can look at my paintings and you can see a strong sense of visual narrative consistency from image to image. And that's a little more challenging because you have to dig a little more deeply, and you have to be more just like with comics, you have to be conscious of how one image talks to the next, how one flows into the next. You don't want your transitions to be too jarring, but you do want to keep things moving. But I really love that challenge because it's so different.
I know that you use a lot of different mediums.
Mm-hmm.
Is there one particular that you really enjoy using? And then on the flip side, is there one where this is more challenging to you? You continue to use
Right.
it, but it is a challenge.
This is easy to answer because it's something I think about all the time. I really have come to love cheap acrylic paint for several reasons. One is it's cheap. I'm pretty prolific. I'm constantly working. So it's easy for me to have to spend way too much on art supplies, but I just go to the craft store, Michael's, and buy all these tubes of cheap craft paint. And it looks great. I don't really understand why someone would feel compelled to spend $35 on a tube of acrylic paint from an art supply store when you can get, the same kind of, well, not the exact same, but I don't know, works well enough for me for $1.50. I go through so much paint, and I love acrylic paint for a couple of reasons. It is very forgiving. It is easy to, if you want to make a slight change or if something didn't turn out the way you want, or if you get a smudge, it's easy. It's very forgiving. You just sort of paint right over it and fix it up. Again, to bring this back to comics, they form a huge part of my visual sensibility. And when you think about early comics before printing methods were so digital, comics were flat planes of color defined by black lines. And that's how I paint. I lay down all the color first, and then the black lines connect everything together and give it form and shape. And that, I think, works best with acrylic paint because there's a nice flat brightness to it. And I like my work to be kind of, especially for the Inferno, I want it to be kind of sickeningly lurid, like sideshow banners and movie posters and things like that. I want it to be sort of like a punch in the eye.
Nice.
I actually got to paint Jesus's penis, so that was an exciting part of the Inferno project.
I think that you and probably a lot of other people have probably thought about how are we going to get the Lord and Savior's ween just right.
It's sort of the culmination of a lifelong dream. Like, I'm knocking all these things off my bucket list. Paint Jesus's penis, and that actually lost me quite a few followers on Instagram, which I considered a great success.
Oh.
So
They'll be back.
Yeah,
they'll be back.
They can't stay away. It's like the first hit is always free, right? So yeah, acrylic paint. I love acrylic paint, and I despise watercolor because it is just so difficult for me to control. And I sort of am a control freak when it comes to art. You know, I sort of want to make sure everything on the page is exactly where I want it to be. And I can't do that with watercolor. I'll use it if I have to, but man, I stay away as much as I can because it's like trying to catch water in your hands. It just doesn't work.
I just watched a documentary maybe a week and a half ago about George Seurat, who is famous for his Sunday on the Isle of Le Pan something.
Something in French.
Yeah, it's the Ferris Bueller's painting, unfortunately, is what it's become at this point. And he specialized in pointillism. And people might say, oh, okay, so it's little tiny dots and you make that. When you see how large that painting of his is, and you think he did this dot by dot at a time when you're mixing your own paint to create the color that you want. Oftentimes you're having to restructure your own brushes. It makes me appreciate the mechanics of art.
It is staggering.
In a whole new way. And not that I have anything against technology, not one bit, but you know, when I see people creating pop art to mimic pop art of the 1960s, and I think like, you know, somebody did that by hand.
Right.
And I have that appreciation for the early comics as well. The fact that someone's working with that and making that happen. And I couldn't agree with you more about watercolor. It is the toddler of art because you don't know what's going to happen.
That's a great way to put it. You're right, because you never know. You don't know where it's going to go.
You're trying to corral it, and you're like, no, don't go over that side.
Oh, it's too late.
Wish I would have given the watercolor a snack first. Matt, you know, as we round this thing down, this has been easily one of the best conversations I've had in months.
Awesome.
And you're one cool dude. So thanks for giving some time to us. If people want to follow you, if they want to check out what you're doing, let's give them the keys to the kingdom to find you online. Awesome.
The two easiest ways. I'm probably the most active on Instagram. Instagram is good because, you know, it is an inherently visual app. So it is a great way to share art. And, you know, I'm pretty active there, posting my work. I love comments. I love critiques. I love challenges. You know, I answer my messages there. And the Instagram is at Matt_Kish_art. And then I do have a website, but it's pretty much a static collection of just sort of selections from my bodies of work. And that is just matt-kish.com. Kish is my last name. But Instagram is probably the best way. I actually, you know, I'm pretty leery of social media for the most part because it can so easily be abused. But Instagram has been decent because it does really allow me to share a lot of work, to see a lot of work. I really do enjoy connecting with people. And I welcome everything from the questions to the challenges. I mean, you know, I put it out there because I want people to look at it, talk about it, pick it apart, question me about it, you know, however they want to deal with it. I want it to be out there, and I want them to know it belongs to them as much as it belongs to me.
I'm on your Instagram right now. You really did nail Jesus's peen.
Yeah. I was so proud of that. I found myself studying pictures of penises to make sure I got it right.
Well, and you know, to be even more specific, you really nailed the pubes too.
I thought about that because I thought, you know, he's a hirsute man, and you know, I sort of went with the we often see Jesus as a bit of a ginger, right? Like that's the typical reddish brown hair. Mm-hmm. Maybe not too terribly accurate, but you know, I'm drawing on my troubled upbringing in the Catholic Church, so I thought, this is it, man. I'm getting you all back.
Well, and he's not going to have access to a lot of electric razors out in the desert.
It's
so
tough,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you didn't care about manscaping. You cared about clean water.
Right, right. I mean, that hair shirt wasn't going to stop itching itself.
Right. This is some very, very cool stuff. Matt, again, thank you so much for the time that you've given us. And of course, you can head over to your local bookshop and order Matt's Moby-Dick project.
Yeah, Moby-Dick and Pictures.
You can get it on Amazon, but throw some business to your local bookshop. They're the
Yes,
ones
please.
who need it the most. Matt, thank you so much. What a fun conversation. This has been awesome.
Thank you, man. I really, really had a good time. Tucker, it was excellent to hear your voice again. JJ, it was great to meet you. And I have been meaning to find an excuse to make it back to Fargo for quite a few years now. I will come in July or August for damn sure, but I will be back.
Yeah,
yes, please.
You should come in late August, and we'll take you to a neighboring town has a whole weekend festival dedicated to the potato.
Awesome. I love potato anything, fries, pancakes, anything. I'm there.
That's going to wrap it up for today's show. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to help us continue to produce new episodes each week, visit jjmeetsworld.com, where you can donate to our Patreon, pick up some swag at the merch shop, or follow our link to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, all the sites the cool kids are using these days. JJ Meets World is produced every week by Tucker Lucas. You can find out more about Tucker's work by visiting moonbasemaria.com. If you want to get in touch with your host with the most, check out linebenders.com, where you can find direct contact info for JJ or booking information. So after just a quick bit of Googling, I gave Don Bluth a lot of credit for We're Back, a Dinosaur Story, but it turns out he had nothing to do with it.